Alright guys, welcome to RC Mojo. This week it's back to the GMade GOM, more specifically the transfer box with the dig. Looks like we'll need the D bag, so we'll unbag that lot and lay it out so we can easily see and find all the bits that we need. The transfer box and the gearbox end up being rather well tied into the chassis and cage structure, so we need to make sure it's all working smoothly before they get fitted. Trying to fix things later will be a bit of a faff. Right, off we go then. Step 14, assembling the shift rod. There's two rods in the kit and they are slightly different from each other, so check against the diagram to make sure you get the right one. From the same packet we'll also need one of the small springs, and from the screws pot we'll just need two small E-clips. That just leaves the shift fork, and just like the shafts there's two in the kit and they're not quite the same, so match it up with a diagram to make sure you get the right one. Okay, we'll clip the innermost E-clip onto the shaft first. This one acts as the backstop for the spring. Next we can apply some of the kit grease around the shaft. We need some under where the spring goes, as well as under the shift fork. It's a case of it's in a gearbox, so we grease it, even if it's not really going to move a whole lot. Slide the fork onto the rod and clip in the other E-clip. Then check the instructions and notice I've just managed to fit the shift fork backwards. Cue some noises that sounded rather like MacLeod that I've kept muted, as I think they might have involved some swearing. On the second attempt I did manage to get it the right way around though. I've seen a couple of forum threads where people have gearbox problems, like the shift shafts being stuck, and it quite often ends up being because one of the forks or clutches are fitted backwards. It's so easy to do if you're not 100% paying attention. Anyway, with the fork on the right way and the spring on the end, we're done with step 14. Right, step 15. Looks like we're going to be prepping the rear output shaft with its gear and clutch. This time we're going to need the 40-tooth gear, the dig clutch. The 2-speed clutch does look rather similar, so check carefully against the diagram. Some bearings from the new bearings bag. There's two sizes that look very similar. We need a single 5x11x4 and three 6x12x4s. The rear output shaft, it's the one with the square section, and we also need a large E-clip. Starting with the gear, we can insert one of the larger bearings in each side. They should slide in with very little resistance as long as they're going in straight. The gear then just slides onto the shaft, but first I'm going to give the area of the shaft that it sits on a thin coat of grease. Not so much for lubrication as we've got bearings, but rather to try and prevent any rust getting started. Now we can slide the gear onto the shaft, making sure that the side of the gear with the larger slots is on the inside so the clutch can grab. If you get it backwards, the clutch won't engage. To hold the gear onto the shaft, we use the big E-clip, being very careful not to damage the bearing with the pliers. And again, because we've probably scratched any coating off the E-clip, we'll pop some grease in there to seal it off before fitting the smaller bearing on the end of the shaft. Next we've got the clutch. Now it does have a right way round, even though it will actually fit either way. One side has the corners sloped off and on the other side they're square. This will be to help the clutch engage and disengage. When you're sure you've got it the right way round, we can go and grease up the inside of the gear where the clutch engages, and along the square shaft, making sure we get a nice coating everywhere. Slide in the clutch and make sure the grease is everywhere it's going to need to be. If it moves, grease it. And just for luck we'll add a bit more behind the clutch too. That just leaves the last bearing, which just slides on the shaft after the clutch. It's worth noting that there's nothing holding the end bearings on at the moment, so watch out just in case they fall off. Step 16. The front output shaft. This one's quite a bit simpler than the rear one, as it's a fixed drive, so no clutch. All we need this time is another 40-tooth gear, the output shaft, and two of the larger bearings. This time, rather than the gear running freely on the shaft with the bearings, the shaft has a key that locks into the gear, and there's almost no detectable slop. Very nice. But just as before, we're going to give everything a thin coat of grease to seal it off, just to try and avoid any future rust. Just a thin coat, then pop the shaft back into the gear. A bit more grease around the flat side of the keyed bit of the shaft, followed by one of the bearings on the end. Flip it over and grease up the other side, then slide on the other bearing. Again, there's not a whole lot holding this lot together, so watch out for it falling apart. Step 17. We're fitting the bits to one half of the transfer case. We'll need to cut the case half free from the parts tree as it's one of the bits that's still there. Snip it off with some side cutters, then trim the rest of the knob off with a sharp knife. The slot in the clutch needs a good bit of grease so the fork runs freely. If you don't, the friction will cause it to heat up and ultimately it could lock up entirely. Add some extra grease on the end of the shift rod so it's well and truly lubed up. Slot the fork into the clutch and carefully insert the assembly into the transfer case. It will need a bit of a jiggle to get the bearings and rods to find their holes, but when they do it should neatly drop into place. It's worth noting that at this stage the shift rod and fork aren't going to move smoothly as they're only supported at the one end. We'll need to have the other case half before everything gets aligned. Now we've got the 22 tooth metal gear and a 5x11x4 bearing. The bearing drops into the hole in the middle of the transfer case, followed by the gear with its flange downwards. This is the gear that ends up taking the drive from the main gearbox. The last bit, of course, is the other gear and its shaft. They just drop into the transfer case. But first we need to pop it out and start feeding the gears with some grease. Pop some on the gears and start rotating them. Keep going until there's a fair coating, then add the gear back and keep spinning and greasing until you can see there's grease on all the gears. It's one of those things where you could just pop a few blobs of grease in there, seal up the transfer case, and it should get spread around when the gears are spun up. But since we've got good access, we might as well make sure it's all lubed up now so we know it's not going to be a problem later. Step 18. Sealing up the transfer box. This time we'll need the other half of the transfer case, 2 bearings, the plastic bushing. Now I believe this is one of the ones replaced with a proper bearing in the Plus kit, 4 M3x12s and 4 M3 plain nuts. Before we fit the 2 halves of the transfer box together, we're going to need to add the bearings. There's a fairly deep hole that we need to press in a bearing, then a bushing, followed by the other bearing. We need to make sure it's fully pressed down. The bearing should end up being flush with the surface. Now the 2 halves can come together. There's a good bit of jiggling involved to get the shafts to line up with the holes. The main thing is, if it's stuck, don't force it. If you have to, back off and start again. To hold the halves together, we use the nuts and screws. For the nuts, there's hex-shaped holes for them to sit in, so it's easy to get everything the right way round. Start by loosely fitting all 4, then we can apply some thread lock. As usual, we want to avoid getting any on the plastic. And now we've got the screws and nuts in position, all we do is get a little bit of thread lock on the end of a cocktail stick and transfer it to the end of the screw. Then undo the screw a couple of turns, not quite enough to lose the nut, then gently do it up again. The screws are going to soak up the thread lock they need without flooding into the surrounding plastic. When we've got all 4 thread locked, we can go around and nip them all up the rest of the way, then wipe off any excess thread lock. And there we go, one complete transfer box. It's not going to spin completely freely yet, as the metal gear in the middle isn't supported on a shaft, so it's just floating around in there. And so that's about it for this week, I think. Seems like a good place to stop anyway, since we've got a complete assembly. Now I'm not entirely sure what we're going to be doing next week, but I'm sure something will come up. It usually does. Anyway, as always, thanks for watching. Like if you liked, subscribe if you want to know when the next video goes live, assuming YouTube is in a good mood. Following us on Twitter might end up being a more reliable way of getting notifications with the way things are going. Bye guys!